Let's talk about Conflict is Not Abuse, Chapter 2, Abandoning the Personal. This chapter has like a little introductory section and then 4 other sections, but before I get to those, I have a note. This is a book that takes a side on a very divisive issue in psychology, which is whether or not mutual abuse exists. Specifically, this book puts forth that mutual abuse does not exist, and I got curious about this debate upon reading that. So I've read a few articles and papers on both sides, and what I have determined is that people on either side of this debate are literally just defining abuse differently. So people who say that mutual abuse does exist are defining abuse as habitually hurting a partner, and that can happen in both directions. People who assert that mutual abuse does not exist put forth a definition of abuse. It needs to be one directional. Because of this, I don't really think it's useful to give my thoughts on that debate, because again, they're just using the word differently. But in order to discuss this book, I am going to have to talk about abuse as something that is unidirectional, because that is the concept presented in this book. In this chapter, Shulman discusses the fact that abuse is a very common problem, and also misusing the word abuse is a very common problem. The word abuse is misused to mean any problem that the person can't solve. And as I mentioned in my note, Shulman defines abuse as a relationship in which one party has power over the other, uses that to dominate and hurt that party. Whereas a conflict is a power struggle between two people of mutual or mutual-ish standing. An idea discussed in this book that I really like is that feeling hurt or feeling wronged does not give you the right to take punitive action against someone, and that volatility or causing discomfort is not necessarily abuse. It's also discussed here how people working in the field of abuse need to investigate who has power in a relationship where there have been allegations of abuse. Which leads into the next section, understanding is more important than producing a victim, in which Shulman says, knowing what really happened is more important than deciding who to punish. This is also where I have a big philosophical separation from Sarah Shulman, because I honestly think the solutions are more restorative and transformative, whereas Shulman does seem to think that there are people who deserve punitive action and punishment. And a lot of the discussion in the book is about how to eke out whether the person in question does deserve that punitive action, whether they have been abusive, and if the correct course from there is then to call the cops and jail the person, basically. There is a quote from this chapter, though, that I love, which is, are you unsafe or are you uncomfortable? Because I think when we are trying to get the details of a situation, trying to understand rather than decide who to punish, it is important to find out if the person telling you what has happened is unsafe in some way. And what I have noticed when asking people, are you unsafe or are you uncomfortable, is that a lot of people don't know what safety is. They don't know what threat is. To a lot of people, uncomfortable and unsafe are the same concept. I would have liked to see this book put forth more nuance about this topic, though, because I feel like the author just gives some examples of like clearly very safe people and clearly very unsafe people, and real conflict is a lot more complicated than that. But I do think this question has potential. This section discusses the fact that it's on the community to come together to do this work of like solving and figuring out, and that the onus is never just on one individual, which I really appreciate. But again, this is a spot where I struggle, because the author is saying that putting the onus of the conflict on one person and then punishing or shunning them is unjust, but there are places in this book where she says you should call the cops on someone. And so I'm just kind of stuck with like, which is it? And lastly, an idea from this section is the gentrification mindset, which is that difference is the same as discomfort, which is the same as danger. And I think that's the kind of bias that we need to look for in ourselves and in the people around us, and to be accountable about. The next section is authentic relationships of depth versus bonding by bullying. This section acknowledges that truth can be complex and conflicting, and the accounts that you get of an event might not match up super well, and the priorities should be to determine if there's danger and then get an order of events. An issue that I repeatedly have with this book is that this section doesn't talk about making sure that people are in a place to answer these questions before you start asking, and I feel like, especially given the system that we already have in place, the one that Shulman is trying to speak out against, if someone's in distress and you start asking them like, well, what happened? What did you do leading up to it? Before they're in a spot to really think about it, I feel like it's just going to come across as moral judgment, even if that's not the intention. And so like, I do think this is a super important process. And also, Shulman seems to think that you can just walk up to people who are in conflict and just start interrogating them and it's gonna go fine. But like, if we go about this in a good way and we are able to actually ask the order of events, that can be super important, because then you can figure out if something caused something else, or if it was the consequence of something else, or if it was both. The next issue that I have with this chapter is really similar to the last one, which is she says that you have the right to resist unjust shunning. And in a vacuum, hypothetically, I agree with that. But in practice, I don't really know how that can go over well. Like if someone says, I don't want to talk to you anymore, if someone is telling their friends not to talk to you, like, yes, that absolutely does suck. And also, I don't think just forcing them back into conversation is going to work. And I don't think it's going to make them favor you. And so I would have liked to see like a more actionable take on how to resist unjust shunning. Because like just continuing to talk to the person when they're still activated, when they have asked you for space, doesn't really seem like the way to do it. And it just seems like these are the sorts of expectations that need to be set up in a group before conflicts happen, or even just in your relationship before conflicts happen. Set up like, if you ask me for space, what do I do? What if I don't need space? For all the talk of negotiating that Sarah Schulman does, she seems to think it's something that happens when everyone's super activated, which is the worst possible time to be doing this work. She does say, though, that the individuals within a group have the responsibility to decide what kind of group it's going to be, how they're going to treat people, how they're going to be just. And I think that is a super important thing to be upfront about. But again, I would like to see more discussion of like what that means in a proactive sense. And community forming gone wrong is what is discussed in the next section, when the community encourages overreaction. I know I, for one, have been in communities that demand justice when there has been an injustice, but their version of that doesn't really track with what I think justice is. Group approval kind of hinges on there being a victim, an innocent victim who has been abused and wronged and hurt, which in turn means having a perpetrator who the group is going to shun or otherwise overreact to and then end up harming. But the thing about that group instinct to shun is that you will then only ever have that one side of the story. And so groups that do that will not come to understand what has actually happened in conflicts. She also draws a straight line between the unquestioning willingness to shun and fascism. And a through line of this book is the way that the concepts in interpersonal conflicts also apply to state conflicts. Which brings us to the final section of the chapter, false accusations and the state, in which the author discusses the fact that perpetrators often file complaints against the people they are hurting, in which they're able to use the system to maintain their control of the situation. It does not require them to look inward or to take any accountability. And this especially affects people who are not in normative relationships, like in queer relationships where misarrests happen about half the time. This section also discusses the way that the behaviors that have been talked about thus far are also used by abusers, like how resisting someone's abuse gets called abuse by the abuser, or how abusers encourage the people around them to shun their victims. And then at the end we get a wrap up of the ideas presented, like that the point of interrogating is not to disbelieve anyone, it is to get a fuller understanding of the situation, and that we should normalize everyone needing help, because then people wouldn't have to call something abuse for it to matter in the public eye. Something just being suffering would be enough for it to matter in the public eye. A quote that I found really impactful was, "Conflicted people have to prove they are eligible for compassion." And I think that's a huge issue with our society. We shouldn't have to prove that we're eligible for compassion. And I hope more of us can just start treating people as eligible for compassion as our baseline. So that was chapter 2. Thanks so much for listening. And thank you to my patrons on Patreon who make this all possible. If you like what I do, like, subscribe, or become a patron yourself if you have a couple bucks. Next time, we'll talk about chapter 3, the police and the politics of overstating harm. See you then.